The prestigious Hamilton University was buzzing with anticipation. Students filled the large auditorium, murmuring among themselves, some excited, some skeptical. Tonight was an unusual event. Vice President J.D. Vance had been invited to speak about American values, the economy, and the future under the Trump administration. Some students admired him, others despised him. But everyone was curious to hear what he had to say. The massive stage was set. A podium stood at the center, draped with the university's banner. The lights beamed down, ready to showcase the vice president as he addressed one of the most politically active student bodies in the country. Backstage, J.D. Vance adjusted his tie, remaining calm and focused. He had been in plenty of high-pressure situations before. This was just another speech, or so he thought. Just as he was about to walk onto the stage, a university staff member hurried up to him. "Mr. Vice President," she said in a hushed voice, glancing nervously toward the stage. "There's been a change." Vance raised an eyebrow. "A change?" She nodded. "Before your speech, our university director, Dr. Richard Whitman, will be making an introduction." Vance smirked slightly. "Didn't know I needed an introduction." The woman hesitated. He insisted. J.D. Vance had seen this move before. A liberal university official, a platform, a microphone. It wasn't an introduction. It was an ambush. Vance gave a slow nod, understanding exactly what was happening. "All right," he said, adjusting his jacket. "Let's see what he has to say." As he stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted. Some clapped, some booed. A clear divide. Standing at the podium was Dr. Richard Whitman, the university director. A tall, authoritative man in his early 60s, dressed in a sleek black suit. He held the microphone with a confident grip, smiling like a man who had already won. He gestured toward Vance, who stood off to the side, waiting for his turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitman said, his voice smooth yet condescending. "Before we begin, let me just say a few words about our distinguished guest tonight." Vance folded his arms, listening. Whitman continued, his smile never fading. "J.D. Vance has built his career on being an interesting figure," he said, emphasizing the word interesting. "From a best-selling author to a politician, and now, of course, Vice President of the United States." Some claps, some whispers. Vance remained unmoved. "But let's not forget," Whitman went on, "that his administration has been one of the most controversial in American history. His policies have been called extreme, authoritarian, even dangerous." The crowd stirred. Some students booed Vance openly. Others stayed quiet. Whitman turned toward him, his smile now a smirk. "So before we hear from our esteemed vice president, let's ask a simple question." He glanced at the students. "Do we welcome open discourse, or do we challenge dangerous ideas?" The crowd erupted. J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He knew exactly where this was going, and he was ready for it. The auditorium buzzed with tension. Some students leaned forward in their seats, anticipating a heated exchange. Others whispered among themselves, clearly enjoying the spectacle. J.D. Vance remained standing off to the side of the stage, his hands resting in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He had expected hostility, but even he had to admit, Whitman was being more aggressive than usual for a university director. Whitman turned back to the audience, his smirk unwavering. "You see," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "in an era where democracy is under attack, we must ask ourselves, are we giving platforms to those who would dismantle it?" The audience reacted instantly. Loud applause from the liberal students, a few boos from the conservative ones. Whitman held up a hand as if calming a courtroom. Now. I'm not saying that Vice President Vance is an enemy of democracy." Then he paused just long enough to let the implication sink in. Vance's lips curled into the slightest smirk. This wasn't an introduction. It was a public execution. "But," Whitman continued, "when an administration promotes mass deportations, attacks the free press, and cozies up to authoritarian leaders, We have to ask, is this the kind of leadership we want shaping young minds? The auditorium exploded. Applause, cheers, boos, pure chaos. J.D. Vance, still standing motionless, let it play out. Whitman turned toward him, his smirk now a full-blown grin. He had all the momentum. "Mr. Vice President," he said, gesturing toward the podium, "I invite you to defend yourself." More cheers. A few students chanted mockingly, "Defend yourself! Defend yourself!" Vance let the noise settle before casually walking up to the podium. He placed his hands firmly on the edges of the lectern, scanning the crowd. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. He finally spoke, calm, measured, controlled. "You know," he began, "I've been to a lot of universities, and I have to say this is the most entertaining introduction I've ever received." A few chuckles from the audience, but Whitman's smirk faltered. Vance continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "I appreciate Dr. Whitman's passionate remarks. But let's be clear, this isn't an introduction. It's a hit job." The audience gasped. Whitman laughed, shaking his head. "Come now, Mr. Vance, that's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" Vance turned slightly toward him. "Is it?" He gestured to the audience. "Because I walked in here to speak to students about America's future. Instead, I got a lecture on why I shouldn't be allowed to speak at all." A ripple of agreement ran through parts of the audience. Whitman's smirk stiffened. J.D. turned back to the students. "Now, Dr. Whitman just said something interesting. He said we have to ask if people like me should be given a platform. So let's ask a different question. Who decides what voices are acceptable?" Silence. Vance stepped closer to the microphone. "Do you decide, Dr. Whitman? Does your faculty? Or do the students here get to think for themselves?" Some cheers. Whitman's jaw tightened. J.D. leaned slightly on the podium. "Because for a guy who claims to be all about democracy, you sure seem eager to silence the people you don't agree with." The auditorium erupted. Cheers, boos, chants. The stage was set, and the battle had just begun. The auditorium was on fire. Students were divided, some cheering J.D. Vance's comeback, others furiously booing him. But one thing was certain, nobody was indifferent anymore. Dr. Whitman, still standing just a few feet away, tightened his jaw. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a calculating glare. He could feel the energy in the room shifting. J.D. Vance had turned the tables. Whitman cleared his throat, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. His voice, though still calm, had an edge of forced authority. "Mr. Vance," he began, "I find it fascinating that you frame this as some kind of censorship issue. Nobody is silencing you. In fact, you're speaking right now." Some students clapped. J.D. Vance let out a slight chuckle, shaking his head. "That's funny," he said. "I was invited to give a speech, and instead, I got an unsolicited lecture from you. That's not hosting a guest, that's setting the stage for an ambush." Whitman waved him off dismissively. "Oh, come now, Mr. Vance, you're playing the victim. You're the Vice President of the United States, and you're trying to tell this audience that you, one of the most powerful men in the country, are being bullied by a university professor?" Laughter from some students. Others, however, stayed quiet, clearly not convinced. J.D. didn't miss a beat. He turned toward the audience, stepping out from behind the podium to address them directly. "You see what he just did?" he asked, gesturing toward Whitman. "This is a classic trick. When they can't argue the facts, they mock you. They try to make you look weak so they don't have to engage with what you're saying." Some cheers erupted. Whitman's nostrils flared slightly. Vance continued, "And let's be honest, he's right about one thing. I am the Vice President. I have power, but you know who doesn't? You." The room fell silent. J.D. scanned the crowd. "You, the students sitting in this room. The ones who will walk across this stage, graduate, and step into a world where people like Dr. Whitman, the so-called intellectual elite, will decide whether your opinions are acceptable or not." Some students nodded ... Vance turned back to Whitman, locking eyes with him. "Tell me something, Dr. Whitman. If I were standing on this stage preaching your ideology instead of mine, would you still be standing here, questioning my right to speak?" The audience erupted. Some students cheered loudly. Others booed even louder. The divide was clear. Whitman was fuming now. "Mr. Vance," he snapped, "this is not about silencing ideas. It's about challenging dangerous rhetoric. And let's be clear, you and your administration have been pushing some of the most extreme authoritarian policies in modern history." The crowd went wild again. JD's expression didn't change. Whitman pressed forward, his voice now harsher. "Your administration has threatened journalists, attacked democratic institutions, and promoted mass deportations. And let's not forget, you work for a man who tried to overturn an election. So tell me, Mr. Vance, what part of that sounds like democracy to you?" The audience roared in approval. Whitman smirked again. He thought he had found his moment, but J.D. Vance, he just smiled. And then, he stepped closer to the microphone. "Let's talk about democracy," he said. The room fell silent again. This was about to get serious. J.D. Vance stood at the podium, his expression calm but focused. Dr. Whitman had just unleashed a full attack, accusing him of being part of an administration that threatened democracy. The audience waited in silence. Some expected J.D. to dodge the question. Others hoped he would get angry, lose his temper, make a mistake. But instead, J.D. leaned slightly forward and spoke in a voice that was calm, clear, and deliberate. "Let's talk about democracy," he said, his eyes locked onto Whitman. "You claim that my administration is authoritarian because we enforce immigration laws. You say we attack democracy because we push back against media bias. But let's look at what democracy actually means." J.D. turned slightly, addressing the students. "A government by the people, for the people," he said. "And who are the people? You, everyday Americans. Not the political class, not media elites, not tenured university professors who think they're the gatekeepers of truth." Some cheers echoed through the auditorium. J.D. continued. "Dr. Whitman wants you to believe that enforcing border security is extreme. But did you know that both Barack Obama and Bill Clinton once supported the very same immigration policies? Were they also authoritarian? Or is it only authoritarian when we do it?" Whitman's jaw tightened. J.D. pressed on. "He says we attack democratic institutions. But where was that outrage when the Democratic Party tried to remove Trump from office using a fake dossier? Where was that outrage when prominent Democrats questioned the legitimacy of the 2016 election?" More cheers. Whitman glanced at the audience, sensing the shift. J.D. wasn't just defending himself, he was turning the attack around. "And let's talk about the media," Vance continued. "Dr. Whitman claims we threaten journalists, but what he really means is, we don't let the media control the narrative anymore." Some students clapped louder now. J.D. turned back toward Whitman, his voice sharpening. "The reality is this. You're not mad that we break the rules. You're mad that we don't follow your rules." The crowd erupted. Whitman's smirk vanished. J.D. stepped away from the podium slightly, scanning the crowd. He had taken control of the room. Whitman, however, wasn't done yet. His face was red now, his voice harsher. "Mr. Vance, you're dodging the real issue," he snapped. "You talk about rules, but what about January 6th? What about a president who refused to accept election results and fueled an attack on the Capitol? You stand by Trump, so answer me. Do you still deny the election results?" The audience roared. Some cheered, some booed. The trap had been set. But J.D. Vance? He just smiled again. The real fight was about to begin. The auditorium held its breath. The moment was here, the one Dr. Whitman had been waiting for. He had played his best card, January 6th. If J.D. Vance hesitated, stumbled, or refused to answer, the media would rip him apart. But J.D., he didn't even flinch. Instead, he chuckled softly. Ah, he said, shaking his head slightly. There it is, the lazy argument. The audience reacted instantly. Gasps, murmurs, some claps from conservative students. Whitman's smirk twitched. You think it's lazy? He shot back. An attack on the Capitol. Police officers injured. The very foundation of our democracy threatened, and you call that lazy? JD stepped forward, his tone controlled but piercing. No, Dr. Whitman, I call your framing lazy. The crowd froze. You don't want a real discussion, JD continued. You don't want to talk about why millions of Americans lost faith in the system. You just want to repeat the same prepackaged talking points so you can feel morally superior. Whitman's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but JD didn't let him speak. You bring up January 6th as if it's the greatest crime in modern history, JD said. But tell me, Dr. Whitman, where was your outrage when major cities burned for months during the BLM riots? Where was your outrage when left-wing activists stormed government buildings? Or does defending democracy only apply when it fits your narrative? The audience erupted. Some students cheered. Others booed. But one thing was clear: JD had just flipped the script. Whitman's face reddened. He was losing control. That is a completely false equivalency, he snapped, gripping the microphone. You're comparing a protest for racial justice to an attack on the United States government? JD raised an eyebrow. Mostly peaceful protests, right? That's what your media called them, even while cities burned. But when conservatives protest, suddenly it's an attack on democracy. The crowd roared again. Whitman looked rattled. JD pressed forward. And while we're on the subject of democracy, he added, I notice you still haven't answered my question. Whitman frowned. What question? JD smirked. The one I asked earlier, he said. If I were standing here promoting your beliefs instead of mine, would you still be questioning my right to speak? Silence. Whitman looked trapped. He could either admit the truth or lie and lose credibility. The audience waited. Finally, Whitman gritted his teeth. This isn't about silencing you, he said, his voice lower now. It's about holding you accountable for your dangerous ideas. JD laughed softly. There it is, he said, shaking his head. The truth. It was never about democracy. It was never about fairness. It was always about control. The crowd exploded. Some students stood up, cheering. Others angrily shouted back. The entire auditorium was in chaos. And Whitman? He had nothing left. JD had won the debate. But the professor wasn't finished yet. He clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. If he couldn't beat JD in the debate, he'd take another route. And JD Vance didn't see it coming. The auditorium was in chaos. Students were shouting over each other, some standing in applause, others angrily booing. The debate had spiraled beyond anything the university administration had expected. But Dr. Whitman was not done. He had lost control of the argument, but he still had one move left. His face was red now, his jaw tight. He turned back toward J.D. Vance, gripping the podium with both hands. All right, he snapped, his voice no longer smooth and controlled, but sharp-heated. Since you're so intent on turning this into a performance, let's drop the act. J.D. Vance raised an eyebrow. You want to talk about democracy? Fine, Whitman said, stepping forward aggressively. Let's talk about you. You, J.D. Vance. You sit here, pretending to be the voice of the people. A working-class hero. A man of real America. But let's tell these students the truth about who you really are. The audience fell silent. J.D. narrowed his eyes. Whitman turned toward the students, his voice dripping with contempt. J.D. Vance didn't rise from the bottom, he sneered. He was handpicked, groomed by Silicon Valley billionaires, funded by the very establishment he claims to fight against. J.D. remained still. He plays this outsider, but make no mistake, he's just another politician, Whitman continued, his voice rising. Another careerist, another elite, selling you the same lies, wrapping it in conservative values so you'll eat it up. And guess what? You bought it. Some students cheered. Others booed. But everyone was watching JD now, waiting to see if he'd crack. JD slowly exhaled, shaking his head. Then he smiled. And he leaned into the microphone. "You done?" he asked calmly. Whitman gritted his teeth. JD nodded. "Okay, let's address that nonsense real quick." He stepped forward. "Yes, I had people who supported me. Just like Barack Obama had donors. Just like Joe Biden had corporate backers. Just like you, Dr. Whitman, have tenure in an institution funded by liberal billionaires." The crowd reacted instantly. JD smirked. "But unlike you, I don't pretend to be neutral. I don't stand up here and act like I'm the sole arbiter of truth while silencing people I don't like." Some students erupted in applause. Whitman's face twitched. "And let's be real," JD continued, shaking his head. "You don't hate me because I'm a politician. You hate me because I'm not your kind of politician. You hate me because I don't apologize for who I am. Because I don't fall in line like every other conservative you invite here to debate, just so you can steamroll them." More cheers. Whitman glanced toward the administrators on the side of the stage. JD caught it instantly. His smirk widened. "And that's why you're about to do exactly what I expect," JD said. "Because you don't like losing." Whitman froze. JD turned toward the crowd. "I guarantee you," he said, "in the next 30 seconds, Dr. Whitman is going to try to shut this debate down. He'll say I've violated university conduct or claim I'm creating an unsafe environment, because that's how they play the game." Whitman's face turned pale. JD tilted his head. "Go ahead, Dr. Whitman. Prove me right." The audience gasped. Whitman whirled toward the event coordinators. "Shut it down," he snapped. "Turn off his mic." The room exploded. JD laughed. "There it is," he said, shaking his head. "The true face of academic freedom." The screen behind him flickered. The microphone cut out. But JD didn't stop talking. Because now the students were listening. And Whitman? He had just lost everything. The auditorium was in chaos. Students were shouting, some in protest, some in outrage. The screen behind JD Vance flickered off. His microphone had been cut. Dr. Whitman stood stiffly at the podium, his expression blank. He had done exactly what JD predicted. But he wasn't the one in control anymore. The crowd was turning. At first, just a few voices. "Turn his mic back on. Let him speak." Then more, and within seconds a full-blown chant erupted. "Turn it back on. Turn it back on." JD Vance stood there, watching it all unfold, completely unfazed. He didn't have a microphone anymore, but he didn't need one. He lifted a hand, a simple gesture, and somehow the auditorium grew quiet again. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "You see, Dr. Whitman, this is the difference between us." The director's face twitched. "You think power means cutting off a microphone. You think you win by silencing people. But real power?" JD turned, gesturing toward the crowd. "Real power is when you can take away my mic, kill the cameras, shut down the stage, and they still don't listen to you." The room erupted. Whitman was speechless. His face was pale now, his confidence shattered. JD gave him one last look, not angry, not triumphant. Just knowing. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off the stage. The students cheered louder. Some stood on their chairs, still chanting. Security guards looked unsure of what to do. And Dr. Whitman? JD Vance just exposed everything wrong with today's so-called free speech culture. The moment his mic was cut, the truth became clearer than ever. But what do you think? Was this a fair debate, or did the university prove his point? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more powerful moments like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Because in times like these, the truth needs to be heard. Be part of the conversation today.